This episode of the Unresolved podcast is brought to you by Harry's Razors. Harry's is a company founded by two guys, Jeff and Andy, who were fed up with the high prices of cheaply made razors. They started their own company to provide a great shave at a fair price, and they are so confident in their razor quality that they'll provide a trial shave set for free when you sign up at harrys.com/unresolved. This free trial set includes a weighted ergonomic razor handle, 5 precision-engineered blades with a lubricating strip and trimmer blade, rich lathering shave gel, and a travel blade cover. All of that, which is a $13 value, you can get for free by simply heading to harrys.com/unresolved and paying a few bucks for shipping. For those of you looking to get your holiday shopping done early, Harry's just released their special edition holiday sets that would make a great gift. I'm normally not one to promote items that I wouldn't personally use, but Harry's razors really do live up to their reputation. I've actually been a fan of theirs for a while now, after heading to my local store and finding Harry's razors to be more than $5 cheaper than the competitors. Once again, you can head to harrys.com/unresolved to take advantage of this great offer and see what Harry's has to offer. That's harrys.com/unresolved. This episode of the Unresolved podcast is also brought to you by Studio Sweden. Studio Sweden is a headphones manufacturer that works hard to provide high-quality Bluetooth headphones that don't lose the quality of whatever you're listening to, whether that be your favorite musical artist, or even the new episode of Unresolved. If you head to studiosweden.com, you can use the offer code UNRESOLVED15 to save 15% off any pair of headphones. Head to studiosweden.com, that's SUDIOSWEDEN.com, to find your favorite pair of headphones today. On January 12th, a Wednesday, 1983, a car was examined on the side of the road. It had been parked there, and for some reason, people were feeling suspicious of the vehicle. It looked a little too neat and clean to be where it was, on the side of a normal residential street, where it had not been seen before. It actually looked like it could have been a taxi, but the sign had been removed from the top. Upon further inspection, police would find a body inside the trunk. The body, belonging to the driver of the vehicle, 58-year-old Angelo Constantine, had been sitting in the trunk for at least a few days. Constantine, who had been born in Athens in 1925, was the last person you would expect to find brutally murdered. Rumors have it that his body showed signs of torture, although the exact details of this are unknown. Just like the rumors of another murder victim a few weeks beforehand, that of Jose Van den Einde. I need to reiterate that these are just rumors, which have been fostered over years by various conspiracy theories. Some of these rumors tried to link Constantine to Lebanese gangsters involved in the auto theft and drug dealing trades. Again, these are just rumors, but would go on to clutter the later investigations and international gossip surrounding the story. I'd feel better letting you know about them now, because they will come up in a later episode when I address some of the various theories and suspects. All we know is that on January 8th, Angelo Constantine had gotten into his taxi just like any other day. It was a black Mercedes 220, which, to me, looks like something you would see a Bond villain drive, but isn't out of place in the Brussels area that Constantine worked within, where most taxicabs seem to be varying degrees of Mercedes and Audis. Constantine had been running short on the day. He hadn't picked up nearly as many customers as intended, so he was working a bit of overtime. After all, he was an independent cab driver, so he could make his own hours. Sometime in the evening, he picked up a customer, or perhaps customers. This would be the last drive that he would ever make, taking him somewhere close to Bergen, the city most commonly referred to as Mons, outside of Belgium. Police speculate that on January 8th, or sometime in the early morning hours of January 9th, Angelo Constantine was murdered. Whoever pulled the trigger likely did so from the back seat of the taxi, shooting him numerous times in the back of the neck. They then shoved his body into the trunk, along with the Brussels taxi sign from atop the car, and then proceeded to utilize the vehicle for the next day or two. By the time his body was discovered, roughly 3.5 days after his murder, the trail into finding his killers had gone cold. Police were stumped. just as they were into other assaults plaguing the area, later attributing all of them to a trio of criminals known as the Brabant Killers. Welcome to the Unresolved podcast. I'm your host, Micheal Whelan, and this is part 2 of my look at the men responsible for the biggest crime spree in Belgian history. If you would like to stay up to date regarding the podcast, you can head to unresolved.me. There you could find transcripts of each episode, along with links to the various sources, musical links, and even social media sites. The podcast is active on both Facebook and Twitter, and can be found at UnresolvedPod for either of those. If you would like to support the podcast and my personal endeavor to get an episode out every week, you can head to patreon.com/unresolvedpod. As I have stated in the past, I am taking the podcast full time, and every little bit of support helps make my dream of a weekly episode possible. You could also get access to a bunch of perks, including swag, monthly episode polls, behind the scenes content, and more. If you aren't interested in becoming a patron, you can easily head to iTunes to rate and review the podcast. Preferably with 5 stars and kind words, but I'll gladly take whatever I can get. Now, without any further ado, we head back in time to 1983, where the crime spree of the mysterious Brabant Killers has continued to escalate. Over the past couple of months, police had become confounded over the emergence of criminals in the Brussels area. Separately, you had a duo of criminals responsible for thieving wine and champagne from a grocery store. You had a trio of men robbing various weapons from a gun shop. And now you had the mysterious murders of 2 men, Jose van den Einde and Angelo Constantine. The only similarity between these last 2 victims is that they were, at one point, taxi drivers. Van den Einde had given up his job as a taxi driver to become the caretaker of the Beersel Castle, but also had alleged ties to right-wing activist groups. Constantine, on the other hand, was an active taxi driver with alleged ties to Lebanese gangsters. Neither of these rumors, either the right-wing activist groups or the Lebanese gangsters, have ever been proven to be fact. However, they were avenues that the police were investigating pretty early on. Besides these crimes, which would all later be confirmed to have been committed by the Brabant Killers, there were numerous other crimes and organizations rising out of the Belgian division and angst from this time period. The late 1970s saw conspiracy theories, ranging from the crazy to the level-headed, centered around the elites of Belgium participating in, quote, sex parties, unquote. I only use the quotation marks because the name of these parties, pink ballets, centered on orgies including minors of both genders. Of course, these were conspiracy theories, but would later be somewhat confirmed when one of the men rumored to have been a part of the Pink Ballets, named Marc Dutroux, became the most well-known serial killer and pedophile in Belgian history. Rumors of the Pink Ballets having a root in truth have lingered ever since. And of course, I can't avoid the obvious, that outside of potential sex rings involving government officials, there were a number of fringe terrorist groups cropping up in Belgium in the early 1980s. Perhaps the most noteworthy, the Westland New Post organization, was built around the framework of an earlier right-wing private militia. The WNP, as it was known, began engaging in infiltration of government sectors in 1981. The Belgian State Security Service was aware of this group in late 1981, and had been trying their best to infiltrate the group in return. But the WNP would go on to just become a beacon for other groups, which would continue to crop up and engage in domestic terrorism. These included bombings, assaults, you name it. As I've said before, there was a lot of angst in Belgium at the time, and it seems like this was being expressed in multiple ways. You could see the same thing happening in America right now, with a lot of right-wing activism becoming popular in pockets throughout the country. But I'll refrain from trying to make modern parallels out of this story. Either way, I just hope that this helps provide more of a context for what police were facing at the time. After all, police would not find out until years later, 1986 in fact, that these various Brabant crimes were committed by the same gangsters. Until such time, they were operating under the assumption that various criminals were committing these widely varying crimes. The Brabant killers, perhaps having some inside knowledge of this confusion, not only fed off of it, but began to profit. Friday, February 11th, 1983. It is approximately 7 o'clock in the evening, and a woman is showing up to work. She works at a store adjacent to a Delhaize supermarket in the town of Genval, which lies on the southeastern tip of the larger Brussels metropolitan area. The woman begins walking into the store, just like any other night. However, a dark figure in a ski mask and a black outfit manages to grab a hold of her, and he is quickly joined by 2 other accomplices. The first thug, who grabbed the woman, threatens her and demands to be taken to the nearby money office. Here, the Delhaize supermarket and all of the conjoined businesses store their money in small safes. The man and woman, joined by the second gangster, rush into the money office. The second criminal, who is a bit shorter than the first, but much more aggressive, begins putting the money into plastic bags. The third gangster, who hovered behind the other 2, makes his way into the grocery store itself. He stands near the front of the store and begins threatening the store manager and customers, demanding that they lay on the floor in a gruff, intimidating voice. After piling all of the money from the back office into plastic bags, the first 2 men return and join the third. They fire warning shots into the ceiling, windows, and shelves of the grocery store. Customers have to dive for cover, but thankfully, no one is seriously wounded. The masked men make off with around 600,000 Belgian francs, which translates to something like $15,000 to $20,000. Police were hard-pressed to get any details of the criminals from the various witnesses. The features of the 3 men were obscured behind dark masks. They did learn that one of the men, the leader of the trio, was a bit taller than the other 2, but besides that, there was no new information to go off of. However, an Audi 100 was sitting in the parking lot at the time of the assault. This Audi would get shot at during this attack, as the mad gunman fired at various targets. This vehicle would oddly come into play a week or so later, but I'll get to that in just a moment. A few days later, on February 14th, Valentine's Day, a woman parked her car in front of her home. She lived just a short distance south of Waterloo for reference, and had noticed a dark-colored vehicle following her. She parked her car, and presumably tried to march up to her house at a brisk pace. However, the dark car, which had been following her for a little bit, came to a screeching halt. She parked her car, and tried to get up to her front door as soon as possible. A man got out of the vehicle, unmasked, and was holding a gun in her general direction. The man, who was approximately 6 feet tall, in good shape, with thick black hair and rugged features, spoke in a thick French accent that made him sound almost cultured, in direct contrast with his appearance. This man demanded the keys to her car, pointing the gun in her direction the entire time. She handed over the keys quickly, and without hesitation, the man turned and got into the driver's seat. The woman, terrified, watched her gray Volkswagen Golf speed off, followed by the dark vehicle being driven by another man. She could not make out any of his features, but the 2 were gone just as quickly as they had arrived. A sketch of this unmasked gunman was made for the police when she reported the car stolen, but the VW Golf he had stolen would make several appearances in the coming months. This was a tactic utilized by the Brabant killers. They liked to steal small, sporty, speedy vehicles to make their getaways in. They would always steal these cars from the area, from low-profile targets, and then utilize them to make quick getaways. Roughly a week later, on February 22nd, the Audi 100 from the grocery store robbery 11 days beforehand made another appearance. The Audi, which had gotten shot up by the perpetrators, was sitting in a garage awaiting an appraisal. There was damage done to the exterior, and it needed some repair work. However, this did not deter the bandits, who somehow found a way to track down the Audi. They broke into the mechanic's garage and moved other cars out of the way to get access to the Audi. They were able to quickly find the keys, and before police even knew about the theft, the thieves were long gone. No one has any idea why the bandits targeted this vehicle. As far as police were concerned, this vehicle had not been used in any known murders or robberies. It was found just a week or two later, on March 3rd, in the area of Ixelles, right near the center of Brussels. My own personal theory is that the bandits had something to lose by this car getting a proper look over. Perhaps some of the bullets had evidence that could link back to the killers or their weapons, but the vehicle wasn't really used between its theft and discovery. Either way, this remains one of the most intriguing mysteries throughout the Brabant killer's crime spree, just because it's so odd. How did they know which garage the Audi was taken to, and why did they feel the need to steal it? Before February was over, the bandits would strike once again. This time, their target was another Delhaize supermarket in the town called Uccle, roughly halfway between Waterloo and Brussels. A 3-door Volkswagen Golf pulled up to the premises, and 2 men exited from the back seat and passenger seat. The driver, his face unseen by any witnesses, remained behind the wheel of the running vehicle. The first man carried 2 weapons and rushed into the store ahead of the other. He demanded that everyone lay down on the floor and began shooting throughout the store in a series of warning shots. The second man, armed with a baton of sorts, ran back towards the manager's office. Apparently, he grabbed a hold of a cashier in the process, demanding that they open the vault. This cashier did not have the key to open the vault, so they needed to request another staff member come back to the office. Out of frustration, this second masked man smashed the nearby telephone. Eventually, they were joined by another staff member who unlocked the safe for him. He began shoveling the money into a plastic bag. The first perpetrator, who was standing guard at the front of the store, noticed a witness outside. This witness, a young man, was running towards the direction of a nearby gas station, presumably to alert authorities. This gunman took sight of the witness and fired a series of shots. At least one hit because the witness dropped to the pavement. Thankfully, he would survive his injuries because no one died during this robbery. The 2 gunmen met up at the front of the store, having managed to earn another $15,000 to $20,000. They got back into the waiting Volkswagen Golf and sped off in the direction of Waterloo, which was south. Both gunmen were described as being big, tall men. Besides that, no real details surfaced that police already weren't aware of. On March 3rd, police discovered the Audi 100, which had been shot up during the February 11th robbery and later stolen on February 22nd. It was found in Ixelles, a district that is basically smack dab in the middle of Brussels. However, March 3rd also saw another robbery from the Brabant killers. This time, they were noticeably less forgiving, and this time, all 3 of the gunmen participated. The area was just outside of Halle, in an area west of Waterloo. The store was a Colruyt supermarket, not too dissimilar to the Delhaize stores that had been previously targeted. The 3 gunmen entered in the front of the store at around 7:30 p.m., and all 3 were armed with firearms. The first gunman, armed with a short-barreled rifle, stood at the entrance and again ordered all employees and customers to lay down on the floor. The other 2 gunmen made their way to the back offices, where store employees were in the process of counting money. One gunman stayed with those employees, demanding they load the money into plastic bags, but another took the store manager into another room where the safe was. The employees in the money office, now laying face down on the floor and powerless to help, heard a series of gunshots from the other locked room. Police would later find the store manager dead, having been shot in the head. This had happened after he gave in to the gunman's demands and opened the safe. The first gunman, who'd been standing at the front of the store and keeping watch over customers, fired upon some shelves in an effort to maintain his threat. A customer would be wounded during this shooting, but survived. The criminals rejoined together at the front of the store, managing to make a combined $30,000 altogether. They piled back into the Volkswagen Golf and sped off into the night once again. However, before they disappeared, they made sure to fire off another round of warning shots at the customers and employees inside of the store. Thankfully, nobody else was killed or seriously injured. With the death of the store manager, They had now killed their fourth victim, and police were still no closer to finding them than they had been the year beforehand. The criminals went quiet for the next couple of months, surprisingly. Perhaps their larger than normal payday in the last robbery, which was close to twice their normal take, allowed them to take a reprieve from criminal activities. They made no major moves in April, at least as far as police are aware of. Allegedly, a hardware store in the Brussels area was burglared in the latter half of May. Apparently, a number of bolt cutters and cutting torches were stolen during this time period, but I haven't found any credible sources to back that up. So, as always, take that rumor with a grain of salt, even though some future stories will somewhat back it up. Then, on a Wednesday, June 8th, the bandits seemed to strike again. This time, they took no human victims, and their target was another getaway car. The workshop the car was housed in, located in Braine-l'Alleud, had roof access. Using this entrance point, one of the bandits climbed up through the ceiling, and then let in the other criminals through a side door. Their target was a dark gray Saab 900 Turbo, a car that did not look like anything special, but did have it where it counted. They were able to easily make off with the car, but at this point, it seemed like they were beginning to get used to the thrill of killing. For no real reason, one of the bandits targeted a dog in its kennel. The dog, a German Shepherd, was found shot to death the very next morning. It had posed no threat to the criminals, but they decided to shoot it anyways. Many people attribute this shooting to the bandit known as the Killer, who would go on to accumulate most of the shooting victims single-handedly. However, the bandits had yet another vehicle to add to their collection, and were looking poised to strike once again. On September 10th, 1983, a Saturday, the bandits made one of their most mysterious attacks. This time, the location they hit wasn't a grocery store or a garage. Instead, it was a textile manufacturer named Wittok van Landegem. You may not have heard of this company, which produced mainly sails for boats and other such textiles, and it closed shop in the mid-1990s. Many attribute this incident into a lot of bad press for the company, which was involved in a secret cooperation with the Belgian police at this point in the early 1980s. When the Brabant killers hit, the company was working on a line of bulletproof vests for police officers. The killers, seemingly aware of this information, hit in the middle of the night. Utilizing the cutting torches and blow torches allegedly stolen in May, the bandits made their entrance into the factory. Before long, they stumbled into the night guard who was working his shift, along with his wife. I could not find a reason for her presence at the factory on the night in question, but the police seemed to not make a big deal of it, so I assumed she was just visiting or was a regular visitor there while he worked. The guard was killed at the scene, having been shot in the head 4 different times. His wife was seriously wounded, but survived her injuries and was able to provide descriptions of the suspects to the police. Neighbors, alerted by the sound of the firearms, awoke and called the police. Some were even peeking out of their curtains toward the factory. The criminals, noticing their presence, fired some warning shots into the sides of people's homes. Thankfully, no one suffered injuries because of these shots. In total, the masked men made off with 7 bulletproof vests, which they would begin wearing throughout future attacks. For a few months preceding this attack, police had begun to grow concerned about the Brabant gang having some kind of inside knowledge. Perhaps they were even cops themselves, operating outside of the law for personal gain or another motive. They had been using tactics that made them appear more than just common criminals. They seemed to have a good knowledge of how to intimidate large groups of people, and besides that, keep them controlled through fear or intimidation. When it came time to use their weapons, outside of threatening others, they also know how to shoot them. They had gotten into 2 shootouts with police, and both times came out the victor. They had yet to lose, often using the element of surprise to overwhelm the responding police force. Now, they had managed to upgrade their arsenal in a frightening way. These bandits had come a long way from stealing a shotgun in the dead of night. Now they had brazenly attacked an armory in the middle of the day, and then robbed a factory of bulletproof vests, which they were supposed to have no knowledge of. If that wasn't scary enough, their homicidal impulses seemed to be sharpening with every outing. People were dying with regularity, and unfortunately, that would only continue to escalate. After the robbery of the textile manufacturer, the killers would wait roughly 1 week before striking again. It's approximately 1:30 in the morning, and a white Mercedes is pulling into the gas station of a Colruyt supermarket. The driver is with his wife. Seemingly unbeknownst to this couple, a burglary was occurring at the Colruyt supermarket just 100 or so feet away. A trio of masked men, using cutting torches, had made their way in through the back door of the store. At some point, the couple in the white Mercedes got pulled into the fray. The bodies of the couple would later be recovered inside of the Colruyt supermarket, long after the police had already responded. The responding police happened to be 2 gendarmerie police officers, but again, they were not prepared for the ensuing firefight. One of the officers went down with a serious injury, and the other was actually killed. The Brabant killers, thinking that both officers were dead, stole their weapons and prepared to make their getaway. It appeared that the bandits had showed up at the crime scene in the Saab 900 Turbo, stolen back in June. However, at least one of the bandits got into the white Mercedes and the 2 cars began making their getaway together. When the call went out that a robbery was in progress, police had gained some inkling that the Brabant killers might be behind it. But when the 2 gendarmes had failed to respond with any updates, the local police force began preparing a response. Sending out police cruisers, they began blocking off some of the major exit points where the gang might try and escape through. The gang was quickly spotted, since a white Mercedes is pretty easily identifiable even in Belgium. The Mercedes was leading the way, followed closely by the Saab 900. One of the police cruisers, preparing to intercept the trio of criminals, blocked the road ahead with their cruiser. Unsurprisingly, this did not deter the crazed gunmen. Using their Mercedes as a battering ram, the bandits slammed into the police cruiser. Immediately, the gunman behind the wheel of the Mercedes, identified in some publications as the Giant, got out of the car without hesitation and began shooting at the police. The other 2 gunmen, sitting in the Saab, began firing as well. Pretty soon, the police cruiser was overwhelmed. Having to retreat, the police managed to make their escape, while the Giant, or whoever had been behind the wheel of the Mercedes, got into the car with the other 2 and sped off into the night. The white Mercedes was abandoned at the scene, and police would later learn that the owner and his wife had been murdered back at the grocery store. Their bodies were recovered, as was the body of the deceased gendarme police officer and his wounded partner, who, thankfully, did survive. The Saab 900 Turbo, which was used as the gang's getaway vehicle, was recovered a short distance away. It was sitting in the middle of an alley with a flat tire, presumably a relic of the gun battle between the bandits and the responding officers. Police were able to recover fingerprints from the Saab, but sadly, this takes me into a point that I have yet to emphasize. Throughout the investigation into finding the Brabant killers, vital pieces of evidence would simply go missing. This would be a problem not only early on in the investigation, but throughout the entire process, even as Belgium began to learn the kind of monsters they were dealing with. The fingerprint records taken from the Saab 900 Turbo would be absent in later searches of the archives. They were just gone, with no real explanation. Of course, this only added more fuel to the theories that at least one member of the gang, or several of them, were active in the police departments or had friends in very high places. Even though the year was drawing to a close, the Brabant killers were nowhere near done sowing chaos and discord throughout Belgium. The restaurant Le Trois Canards, owned and operated by Jacques Van Camp, sits in the town of Ohain, amidst open fields and rolling hills. The street itself, a quiet little neighborhood, is a very quaint and isolated area of Ohane, surrounded by kilometers of farmland. In fact, it's just a short distance away from a noteworthy 1815 memorial, which remembers the fallen victims from the Battle of Waterloo. Jacques Van Camp, the owner, was stepping outside with two of his employees in the early morning hours of October 2nd. It was around 1 o'clock in the morning, and they might have just been having a smoke after closing up shop, but by all accounts, Van Camp was preparing to leave. A gunman appeared from the darkness and rushed over to the three strangers. Right behind him was a second attacker. The first gunman led the two employees inside the restaurant, while the second stayed outside with Jacques Van Camp, holding him hostage in a way. The first gunman, now inside the restaurant, gathered up the 7 employees still working and made them lay down on the floor. He then demanded the keys for a pair of vehicles sitting in the parking lot, namely a Porsche and an Alfa Romeo. When the reaction from the employees was slow, he fired a shot into the refrigerator door to intimidate them. He then began to gather up whatever money he could find, which wasn't a lot, and began to make his way outside. However, as he was gathering up money, the employees that were indoors recall hearing gunshots from outside. As the two bandits met up outside, the employees can hear a verbal exchange between at least 2 men in a foreign language. This implied that it might not have been either French or Dutch, since the employees should have had some familiarity with both, but it's really hard to tell without any more information. However, after this, they heard a few more gunshots. Despite having the keys to a Porsche and the Alfa Romeo, the bandits decided to steal a red Volkswagen Golf GTI, which belonged to the restaurant owner's daughter. Perhaps it was the familiarity with the model that drew them to it. Having used a Golf in some of their prior assaults, they might have just been comfortable with its compact, shifty maneuverability. However, within moments, the killers were long gone. By the time employees rushed outside, Jacques Van Camp, the restaurant owner, was dead. Like other victims of the Brabant killers, he had been shot in the head multiple times. They also noticed that the 3 remaining cars in the parking lot, including the Porsche and the Alfa Romeo, had a single flat tire each. The bandits, before leaving, had shot one out on each vehicle for some reason. It's hard to tell why exactly, but they had themselves a new getaway vehicle and were preparing for yet another attack. It wasn't even a week later when, on Friday, October 7th, the Brabant killers attacked yet another supermarket. It was around 8 p.m. when a black Volkswagen Golf pulled into the parking lot of a beer cell area Delhaize. Their vehicle was the red Golf from just a few days beforehand, but had been given a paint job. By all indications, it also sounds like the bandits had changed the license plate, fabricating the vehicle into an inconspicuous getaway car. The trio step out into the night, and within moments, they have grabbed their first hostage, a man that was simply heading into the store ahead of them. They press a gun into the back of his neck and threaten to pull the trigger if he does anything at all to give them a reason to. The 3 men enter, 4 if you include the hostage, and the store is immediately on high alert. The store manager steps up to deal with the men and is instantly shot dead. Another employee is shot at for an unknown reason, and while he does go down, he would survive his injuries. One of the masked men, the Giant, stays at the front of the store, holding his gun to the neck of the hostage. He demands that a cashier get up from the floor in order to gather cash from the various registers into a plastic bag, allowing only this cashier to move. The other 2 attackers head to the direction of the back offices, which are separated through an outer corridor. One of these men stands watch in the corridor, watching the shop to see if any activity comes his way, while the other heads into the money office to open the safe and empty the contents into a plastic bag. The gunman standing watch in the corridor is described as being of average height and well built, a bit stocky but strong looking. Witnesses also recall seeing a tattoo on his forearm and describe him as seeming older than the other 2. The second masked man is described as being tall, if not as tall as the Giant, and he is not holding a firearm. Instead, he is gripping a long-handled axe throughout this attack, something that is much easier to defend against than a gun, but perhaps more intimidating in the right hands. If their reputation had preceded them, then knowing that the axe was in the hands of the man known as the killer might be scarier than him holding a submachine gun like the other two. The three attackers meet up at the front of the store and, satisfied with their loot, around $30,000, simply leave. They leave behind a deceased store manager who had seemingly stepped up to defend his employees, and 3 wounded survivors, who would recover from their injuries, but would never be able to eliminate the traumatic memories of this encounter. On the way to the car, they keep hold of their hostage, but they do let him go as soon as they're seated and have the engine running. One note that investigators were able to glean from witnesses was that the giant, the very tall and thin gunman that stayed at the front of the store with his gun pressed to the hostage's neck, had a very noticeable birthmark on the side of his own neck. This was surprising, and would hopefully help identify him at a later date. The criminals went into another little bout of silence. This was becoming a habit of theirs. They would have splurges of criminal activity, and then disappear for a matter of months. In one upcoming example, they disappeared for nearly 2 years. But before that would happen, the criminals would strike again. This time, it was not in a public place for the world to see. Just like the murders of Jose van den Einde and Angelo Constantine, they would strike at a business, which, this time, just so happened to be a family's home. It was the first day of December, 1983, in a small town named Angelo. At around 6:30 in the evening, all was quiet. Because this was at the dawn of winter, all was dark by this point in the evening. The 4-piece Polish family was split up, with the parents downstairs and their 2 daughters upstairs. The family was the Music family. The patriarch, Jean Music, owned a small jewelry shop, which was attached to the family's home. He called this his workshop. It was at this time, 6:30, that the daughters recall hearing what sounded like gunshots coming from their father's workshop. While the younger daughter stays upstairs, the oldest begins bravely stepping down the steps, in the hopes of seeing what's going on. What she does see is a sight that will undoubtedly stick with her forever. A strange man she has never seen before is lying on the kitchen floor, screaming to an accomplice of his, demanding that this other man shoot his weapon. The other intruder, which some publications state as being on the other side of a door leading into the garage or the workshop, was holding a long-barreled handgun. The target of this handgun? That would be Jean Music himself, standing at an opposing side of the kitchen, holding a pistol of his own. We can only surmise that the man laying on the kitchen floor was hurt, or somehow knocked to the floor, as his presence there makes no sense without some kind of explanation. When he called out for his partner to shoot, he spoke French, which matches with what we know of the Brabant killers. However, at seeing this shooting about to break out, the daughter scurries back upstairs towards her sibling, desperate for all of this to be over. What she hears behind her is more gunshots, in various increments. For at least a moment or two, it goes silent, but then there are more shots fired. Just like that, though, the war waging downstairs ends. The doorbell rings, likely a neighbor wondering if everything is okay. A short time later, the girls come downstairs, and the intruders are long gone. However, the masked men have ruined yet another family, and created a pair of orphans. Marie Music, the mother of the 2 girls, was found downstairs in the family's living room. She had been shot multiple times, in the legs, chest, and head. Police speculated that she was the first to be shot, as the men had likely appeared as customers before opening fire on the unsuspecting woman, thus sparking the attention of her husband. Jean's body had been found in the workshop, and not many details have been released about that. It's hard to tell whether or not he managed to fend off 3 armed intruders and fight them off into the workshop single-handedly, or the darker theory exists that the intruders took his body into the workshop for some reason, a reason we could only blindly speculate at. Others have questioned How or why Jean Music had been so ready to react to armed gunmen that he had a gun in hand just moments after the first shots were fired. Many would later say that the family had been burglared before, so Jean had purchased a gun to scare off potential thieves. This gun, mind you, was stolen from the Music home by the bandits and was never recovered. When police looked over the scene, they discovered that only a paltry sum of money and belongings had been stolen. There was roughly $3,500 worth of cheap jewels and cash stolen from the Musics, along with some other trinkets that were relatively inexpensive. As would become common for the Brabant killers, their violence often exceeded their take. It just seems silly to kill two people and cause so much irreparable harm for, what, $1,000 each, give or take some gas money? It just makes no sense to me over 30 years removed from the crimes. Police at the time were absolutely stumped as to why these murders occurred. The culprit's getaway car was found about 3 kilometers away, in some local woods. This was the Volkswagen Golf GTI, which had been stolen in October from the restaurant murder. They had painted the once red vehicle a darker color, but now doused the car in gasoline and set it ablaze. The vehicle was missing most of its identifiable markers and had been modified. This implied some semblance of mechanical know-how, which would come up in several later theories, and would actually become a focal point for one of their most notorious crimes. But that's a story for another day. The criminals known as the Brabant Killers had become a blight upon the area of Brussels. In less than 2 years, they had become a menace upon the people of Belgium, a boogeyman that popped up at any time and anywhere to create chaos and misery. However, after this crime, the murder of Jean and Marie Music, the gang of Naval went dark for nearly 2 years. There was never an explanation for this gap in their crimes, only theories and speculation. In that meantime, focus was put on the witness testimony of the Music daughter, who had seen one of the criminals laying on her kitchen floor. Police speculated that one of the thugs might have been wounded or suffered an injury of sorts, even though no evidence of this was found at the scene. Investigators continued to focus on the Brabant killers as being just bandits, thugs inspired by greed and an alcohol dependency to commit their crimes. After all, most of their crimes involved some kind of alcohol getting robbed, such as wine or champagne, as well as caffeinated beverages like tea and coffee. Some were not so sure that these were your typical thieves with a souped-up arsenal. Theories began to be thrown around that lumped in the Brabant killers with various terrorist organizations, such as the Communist Combatant Cells, the CCC, or the Westland New Post organization. The investigative team had begun to look at another group of criminals, known as the Bahrains, and associated them with the Brabant killers. However, the police in charge of the Bahrain investigation held on to them in custody for months, and in that time span, the Brabant killers committed at least one of their violent assaults. The Bahrains were released in October of 1983, and later forensic testing proved their innocence. The police in charge of investigating them did not release this information for months, at which point public confidence in their own police force was failing. It's hard to tell where this lack of confidence in the police force and government began, but that would become the metaphorical chicken or the egg of the entire story. Were the Brabant killers a response to the misguided government, or were they responsible for it? This question has yet to be answered. To be continued in part 3 of the Brabant Killers.